Welcome to this special episode of the Future of Crypto Compliance and Future of Money podcast. This is a very special episode where we're joined by Christina Rolle, the Executive Director of the Bahamas Regulator, the Securities Commission of the Bahamas. Really to give her side of the story of what happened 3 years ago during the FTX collapse. This is an exclusive and the first time that the Bahamas Regulator is speaking on such a podcast, really to share their side of the story. Christina Rolle, a graduate of Northwestern University's Kellogg MBA program and the London School of Economics, spent a decade at Credit Suisse and then Société Générale before joining the regulator about a decade ago. Ms. Rolle, thank you and welcome to the Future Crypto Compliance podcast.
Thank you, Henri. And Henri, I just want to say publicly that you're perhaps the main reason the Bahamas developed digital asset regulation. You may recall that we met each other in Budapest in 2018, and you presented at IOSCO, and coming out of your presentation really was the catalyst for the reason we developed the framework for digital assets. So thank you for that.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. I was going to start a podcast. Remember when, and obviously I still remember the first meetings we've had in the Bahamas back in the day as the DARE Act was being written. So it's funny how it all came together years later. But Ms. Rolle, I really want to start maybe to give a sense to our audience before we go into details of FTX. Can you maybe give us a bit of context on the framework that was in place in the Bahamas, with the DARE Act? And then I want to start really doubling down on what happened during that week in November 2022.
So Henri, as I just mentioned, we first got the ideas to develop the framework for digital assets in 2018 after your presentation at IOSCO. And one of the things that became very clear to me following those discussions and some of the work we did subsequently was that there was a framework that we were very familiar with. And that framework is a framework for the regulation of the capital markets. And so what we did in that context is that we developed a taxonomy, because that's really what the legislation is. It's a taxonomy for the regulation of digital assets, and we base that on capital markets principles. And so about 2 years later, that became the DARE Act. But of course, in the crypto space, unlike the securities space, the crypto space was continuously evolving. So there was so much we didn't know about how the activity was working in the space. So we needed sufficient in the framework that would give us regulatory and supervisory authority, but also allow the flexibility for the industry to develop. And so those were the principles behind how we developed the framework.
And truth be told, I think it's one of the best frameworks we had out there, especially back in the day, that actually covered a lot of these items, right? And we'll get more into it in a second. So how did the FTX connection happen with the Bahamas? Was it a coincidence? Was it luck? Is there a backstory how Sam McAfee and FTX happened?
So we were also surprised when we attracted what was at the time the second largest crypto exchange in the world. We were also surprised. I mean, we thought we would develop this framework and we would have a trickle of exchanges globally who would be interested, but we never thought in our wildest dream that we would attract perhaps the second largest crypto exchange in the Bahamas. And so they probably started, we passed the legislation in December of 2020, and they started to approach the Bahamas in February. So somehow they became very aware that the legislative framework was out there. And they started to approach us in February 2021. And it from the point of the initial approach, it took us about maybe 7 months to get the application to a place where we were able to say, okay, we'll give you an approval in principle, and then you need to meet some other legal obligations. And so we had some extensive back and forth with them over their entry into the Bahamas.
You are a financial advisor and want to learn more about Bitcoin? Check out my new chapter from the CoinShares Digital Assets, the Advisor's Brief series that covers all of the essentials from the history of money and how Bitcoin works to the role Bitcoin will play in the future of finance. And all this in less than 10 minutes. The video is available on the CoinShares website, link available in the show notes. And to be fair, I think at the time there was not many jurisdictions that had proper regulatory frameworks for digital assets. I think that's what made the Bahamas actually quite attractive. That has a pretty comprehensive, not only taxonomy
And
but also
that's
framework.
that's exactly right. And
Yeah.
what we saw was that there were some exchanges out there. There were some digital asset players who were really looking for regulatory clarity. And I think and there were some jurisdictions that were going into the direction of a sandbox. There were some jurisdictions that were testing other things. But sandboxes again don't necessarily provide that clarity. And then there was always the problem of how do you get out of the sandbox and into a real regulatory environment. And so we were one of the first jurisdiction to give that clarity in a very comprehensive way.
Yeah, I think like many in my audience know, when I was a PwC partner and a global crypto leader, I mean, I had the privilege of writing many of their legislation around the world or being involved in it. And I have to say, really, to credit of the work that you and the commission have done, I think it was really the Bahamas had one of the most comprehensive regulatory frameworks out there. I mean, I know I'm biased because PwC was involved in it, but I honestly I think it's
Thank
one of the
you.
better regulatory regimes that are out there. So it's interesting that obviously the FTX came and how was before, let's say, all the incidents that happened, what was the footprint or the impact that FTX had on the Bahamas as a country? Let's take a step back from the regulator. Like, were they welcome in the early days as they were setting up in the country?
What is very interesting is that I think globally there were a couple other things that were going on. Because I think initially they were just going to get a license in the Bahamas. I don't know that they really had an intention to establish the Bahamas at their headquarters. And then less than a week after we gave them an approval in principle license, I think China clamped down on crypto.
Yeah, 2021.
And yes, and this was in September 2021. And they, at that point, made a decision that the Bahamas would become the headquarters. Now, what that means for us in the context of the regulator, that still means that we only were really regulating one entity, even though they moved the entire shop to the Bahamas. And they moved other entities like Alameda and other entities that were unregulated entities to the Bahamas as well. But certainly all of that decision was taking place in the context of what was going on globally. But I think initially their intention was that they would get a license in the Bahamas for one arm of their entity, and I would say they were welcome. I would say that they were embraced by the government. Um, um, Certainly, what we saw as a regulator was that their presence here attracted a lot of other crypto firms, much more so that we would have seen for a new piece of legislation.
So until then, it was definitely a success, I guess. Yeah, you're one of the biggest players at a time, probably the highest rated, reputable firm was coming to town, and then I guess it attracts a lot of players. I remember, I think I'm one of the few. I don't know if it was lucky or not, but I actually visited their offices. It was quite beautiful, actually, very very large. Office they had actually in the Bahamas. I remember one thing that they had done at the time was they had set up their own bus system for their staff to go
Okay.
around the city, and I know they had also they were playing a big role in just because of the real estate they were getting and the entertainment, all this stuff. I mean, so you must have a kind of direct economic impact, beneficial impact actually on the country, I
Oh
believe.
yes. I mean there were rumors around the island and so I usually contain myself to the regulatory space, but we live on a small island, and so there were so many rumors about the extent to which they purchased real estate. Certainly, we saw the price of high end real estate across the island really being driven up by their presence here. I mean, this was an entity that within a very very short space of time they probably acquired more than $200 million in real estate in probably less than a year. That's a game changer for the economy of
Wow.
the Bahamas
Sure. Sure.
in such a short period of time.
What was your impression of SBF the first time you met him?
It was probably, I met him for the first time in person about a few days after we licensed the entity, about, maybe a week, maybe a week. I met him for the very first time. I gathered that he had a meeting earlier that morning with the Prime Minister, and then he came to the Securities Commission to visit us. He strikes me as probably a little bit odd, but certainly not very social or not very socially adept. But certainly when he started to talk about the specific issues on crypto, it was almost as if he switched on. And you saw a different person, and so when he and I talked about, the reason we took certain steps in the legislation, you saw him switch on. I saw him switch on. I saw him, those points that we made about why we did certain things in our legislation. I certainly saw that they resonated with him. He was very responsive, very talkative around very specific issues
Interesting.
in the crypto space.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know if was he wearing shorts and t-shirt or he had dressed up for that day.
I think he was in shorts and t-shirt. I'm
He was.
almost sure of it. I'm almost sure of it. I don't think I've ever seen him in person in a suit.
Yeah.
No.
It's interesting. At a time, Mr. Rose, you probably remember, I used to come to the Bahamas actually quite a bit, not only because of my PwC role, but I served for many years on the board of Deltec, another bank in the Bahamas. And I remember there was an FTX did an event. It was a couple of months before its collapse, and still have the image, the picture, I think, of SBF was interviewing Bill Clinton and Tony Blair on stage, but wearing short and t-shirt, and I couldn't believe it. Somebody does a lot of on
I
air
I
and
have a
TV.
picture of that as
Oh, here you
well.
go.
I
That
think I
was
was in the front row.
and I still remember that feeling. I always remember myself. I said, if I ever did that, my mom would kill me if I went on stage and showed a T-shirt with the former president and prime minister. But it is what it is. So let's talk about actually the months, because obviously the months prior to the collapse, there was obviously I remember there's a big FTX event that in the Bahamas that FTX organized. There must have been thousands of people that had flown in. And then maybe I think where I'm really keen to get your insights is how did it happen? Let's say if you can walk us through your side of the story of how did it happen? How did you even first hear there was these challenges with FTX? And give us your side of the story. I think many of our audience would love to hear about it. Now, 3 years later, there's been books written about the event, about him, and a lot. But I think love to hear your perspective of it.
Yeah, and I'm probably going to try to stick to everything things that are just in the public domain. I mean, I think so. Prior to the event, where we were with FTX being set up in the Bahamas, as I said, they had one entity that was licensed and regulated by us. They were thinking about, I think, establishing other entities for various purposes, but those never actually got over the line. And I think internally they were also going through a migration process of migrating clients from other FTX entities to the Bahamas. That process wasn't even completed by the time as the entity eventually collapsed. But certainly they were still in a transition phase for their operations from the time they were licensed in September 2021 to the time they collapsed in November 2022. So they were still in that transition phase of transitioning operations from other parts of FTX and moving those operations to the Bahamas. In terms of how we found out, I think it unfortunately we found out probably the same way the rest of the world did, that they were having financial troubles. There was a weekend, I think it was the weekend, the 6th, 7th of November, when there was a lot of activity over Twitter talking about FTX having financial trouble. So we were monitoring that activity over that weekend, and we were monitoring what was happening. And by the time as we came to the office on Monday, we started reaching out to FTX about whether there may be some issues. Now, you know, also in the Bahamas, so we were also monitoring, as you know, Henry, because you've been to the Bahamas a lot. From August to late October is really the height of the hurricane season.
Yep.
And so we had a very late tropical storm that was passing. And so we're trying to monitor what's going on there. And we're also monitoring this tropical storm to see what's happening. So we have two storms on the horizon, that we're trying to figure out. Okay, what's going on here? And we were reaching out, and they were unresponsive.
Unresponsive.
Yeah, they were unresponsive. And I think it was a Tuesday. I finally reached out personally, and we still, they were being unresponsive. I think by the Wednesday we were home for the day because of the tropical storm. So we were out of office that day, but it was during that day that I finally got their lawyer to reach Ryan Salome and Ryan Miller, and they agreed to a call with me. And to be fair, we were probably thinking that at that point we were probably thinking that when the office opens back up on Thursday morning, we were probably going in for what we call an examinations for cause. That's what we were thinking. But by 4 o'clock that day, we had that fateful telephone call, and they essentially said there was fraud. And so probably within 2 to 3 minutes of that call, probably the wheels were turning in my mind. I was trying to wrap up that call and thinking that I'm going to put this entity into liquidation
Oh,
at that
wow.
point.
Wow. So what happened? So you had the call with Ryan Salame, just for the audience who's now serving a couple of years term in prison, and then with Ryan Miller, you realize that they're telling you there's fraud. Uh, what happened afterwards?
So we at our end had to mobilize quickly, to prepare ourselves, to go to court the next day. We made the internal decisions we needed to make. We identified a liquidator. We made those internal decisions. And we, of course, we have to go through some enforcement protocols to do that. And so we had to do all of that. And then Thursday, we actually had scheduled a meeting for at our office with Sam Bankman and 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 his lawyers for Thursday. But after the call, I also filed a, a letter with the police, basically an initial criminal complaint, to trigger an investigation on their end. I mean, it was my responsibility at that point to make that filing, and so I was having conversations with the commissioner of the police, having conversations with liquidators, also trying to get those items coordinated. Um, the conundrum the police would have had, and I don't need to speak for them, but I'm knowing, being familiar enough with criminal law in the Bahamas, the conundrum the police would have had in the Bahamas is that they would need some evidence of fraud, in order to charge. We're very much like the British system. And so they would have needed some evidence. We so on the Thursday we focused on, first we suspended the license, and then we focused on getting the entity into a provisional liquidation.
Wow. It's very quick, quite good. And what was going in your mind? I mean, it must have been surreal in a way that,
So it was, and Henry, we are a jurisdiction that relies heavily on financial services, and I would tell you at that point, I was very concerned over whether I was overreacting. I mean, I was very concerned, and not because the circumstances didn't look like it was the right thing to do. The circumstances did look like it was the right thing to do. I was concerned about it because I knew that if we were getting this wrong, what the impact could be for financial services in the Bahamas, what the impact could be for the future.
Hey everyone, Henri here. Can I just ask for a quick favor? If you enjoy this content, can you please like or subscribe? It really helps empowering the algorithm and have more people discover the show. This in turn allows me to invite better guests and that can continue adding value to you. Thank you very much in advance. Now back to our show. Absolutely, I can see, especially that the brand that FTX had in the market until that week was quite high, and I
Absolutely.
remember at the time there was a couple of things I want to ask you about. One of them, there was a freezing of the wallets. I know it was heavily mediatized at the time. Can you maybe share with us? So on Thursday, basically, you put the complaint to the police. Can you walk us through? Because I remember there was a freezing of assets that the commission did. Share with our audience like what happened then.
Yeah. So what happened? So on Thursday evening, we put them into liquidation, and Sam has said it publicly, so I think I can say this, that he claims that because we made that move, he was pressured into filing a Chapter 11 before Friday morning, which he did, which then triggered the windup or the bankruptcy of all of the other entities outside of the one that we already had in provisional liquidation. And so by Friday, all of FTX was in some sort of wind-up process, some bankruptcy, restructuring, or wind-up process, all of FTX. And so Friday was a little bit of a whirlwind with those types of activities and managing what may have been going on there. On Saturday, we had organized an interview, which would have been now our first interview with Sam Bankman. And what was different about this interview is, well, whether he would have been coming in voluntarily on the Thursday, we issued an order for him to come in on Saturday to be interviewed. That was an order issued to him. When he came to our offices and the interview began, the interview was primarily conducted by our enforcement manager, Mr. Gwayne Ward. And when he came into our offices, he started to talk about there being some activity over the wallets of FTX, which suggests that someone was trying to hack the wallets. And so that may have been maybe 10 minutes into the interview. At that point, I left the room and got in touch with Fireblocks. I probably was sure enough that, you know what, we do have the legislative power to take these assets into our custody. But I knew that we had to think through this process very, very quickly. But I left the room. I spent a couple hours opening a wallet with Fireblocks to receive these assets. After interviewing Sam Bankman, we informed him of our intention to take the assets. We, however, needed a court to authorize our ability to do that. And so me and my colleagues, we left the office, and I think you physically know where our office is in relation to where the FTX offices were, and so we're on completely opposite ends of the island, and this is in the middle of Saturday traffic, right? We have to drive through town to do it, and so the drive probably was about 45 minutes from my office to their office. So in the middle of that drive, I had to hire a lawyer and explain to him, explain to that lawyer, because we have a lot of lawyers and there are different types of lawyers. I needed a specific litigator who could go before a court and explain to them what these assets were, first of all, and why it is that we needed to take them into our custody for safekeeping, which was an extraordinary act and something that regulators really aren't used to doing, or used to thinking that they would have to do. But again, all of this was new territory, and so our primary concern at that point was protecting the interest of clients and creditors.
Because there was
But
a lot of talks at a time that some of the assets were also being taken by the U.S. side as well, right? I remember there was
oh
something
yeah,
like that.
yes, and that is true, and that did occur, quite a bit
Interesting.
of it. Yeah, and that did occur, quite a bit of it. Yeah.
How do we, I mean, obviously, I want to talk about the US in a second. I mean, were you surprised that there was also an insolvency case in the US that was put in place, or that it
I
happened so quickly?
I was surprised that he made that filing. Yes,
For the US one, interesting.
yes, I was surprised that he made that filing. We didn't get any warning of it. Um, yes, so I was
Oh,
surprised by that.
interesting. And how, then obviously that was on Saturday, you mentioned. Because then what day did he get? He got arrested a couple of days later, obviously from the Bahamas police.
It was probably almost a month later.
Afterwards, huh? And
Yeah,
during that
yeah.
time, I presume as a regular, you had a lot of interaction with him. I would expect, right? In the day,
We
in the
we
week.
did have we had a series of interviews
Oh,
with
well,
him. Really trying to get to the bottom of what happened. And to be honest, I think that night that we took those assets, I gathered that the police confiscated his passport as well as the passport of Gary Wang. And and that was an alternative to arresting them at that point. And I guess what really was going on with the police is that they didn't think that they would have sufficient evidence to bring charges within 72 hours, which was the maximum amount of time that they would have been able to hold him for without bringing any charges. And so the risk would have been they arrested him, can't bring charges within 72 hours, and then he's a flight risk. And so we're about an hour and a half from Cuba, which has no extradition treaty with anyone, and that could be a nightmare for the Bahamas if he took flight, right? And so I think the police, their strategic decision at that point was they would confiscate their passports and while we had an opportunity to gather evidence.
how was how was SPF and his team in those days following the insolvency? Were they cooperative? Like even personally, were they fully stressed? I mean, I presume stressed out, but how did you
So,
find them?
so, so, yes, I would say that he was very cooperative. His demeanor to me didn't strike me as someone who was very conscious that, you know what, you're in a lot of trouble here. Or nor did he seem particularly concerned about the loss of his personal wealth. He seemed much more concerned to me with restoring his reputation and removing this impression that he that he deliberately stole money or something. And so he seemed much more concerned about that. Whether it's genuine, I can't say, but that was what he presented for sure.
And what about his team, the people around him? that I'm sure you had a chance
So,
to meet?
so there was hardly anyone left around him at that point. I think most people abandoned ship at that point.
Wow. That must have been. I mean, do you think that was rough on him as well? Like, I'm just curious. Like, people left him, and all the people that were
I
working
would
with him.
imagine it would have been. I would imagine it would have been. I know his parents were on island at the time. I don't know what the level of professional or emotional support he was getting otherwise, but I would imagine it was. Yeah.
And now that we
I mean,
look
it would
back,
have been if it were me. It would have been on me. Yeah.
yeah. How was it? I mean, now that we're 3 years, after this event, and you look back, as a regulator, like, if is there one thing that you would have done differently? I mean, that week, those 2 weeks, 3 weeks must have been complete stressful. I mean, I can imagine the shock you must have gone through. But now that you look back at it, 3 years later, anything you would have done differently, or anything you've learned from that experience that you think could be useful to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the things that we got right was to focus on principles, and that allowed us to be able to address the scenarios as they address the scenarios as they came up without having to have provisions for every specific scenario that could occur. And so I think that was something that we got right. Looking back now, if I were to address that situation for again now, instead of putting FTX DM into liquidation, I probably would have put FTX trading into liquidation as well.
Oh wow! So even to expand the scope of not only digital markets but the broader one as well. Because what I mean, do you think there was the whole U.S. Bahamas thing created a lot of confusion, created a lot of issues
I don't.
afterwards?
I think it created. I think it created a fight that was unnecessary. I think that the truth is, in the Bahamas, we had no interest outside of creditors and clients being made whole, but of course we're in a jurisdiction, and we're in a foreign jurisdiction. We're in a tiny jurisdiction, and so that created an unnecessary territorial fight. Now, do I think that we have the manpower in terms of the resources to have dealt with the entire scope of FTX globally? We probably would have had to bring in resources. We probably would have had to bring in lawyers, crypto experts, and others from the U.S. Certainly, I don't know that while we have very capable people, we probably just don't have enough of them in the Bahamas. But certainly, I think that had we made that move, it could have gone a lot smoother.
And what's your view on, when I look at it from outside, I often say that the Bahamas was unfairly tainted because of the FTX. Ironically, like the regulator, your team, to your credit, like as you mentioned, you did all the right things that were in place, and the regulations, actually, the framework was quite solid. But because of FTX, kind of the Bahamas got tainted with this FTX, let's say, saga. Do you believe the Bahamas has recovered of that, or the damage will linger on for years to come?
I don't know that we're fully recovered. I mean, I think that there are quarters that will still hold our feet to the fire over that. I think though that when I encounter most people, and maybe because they're encountering me directly, they give a different face to it. But when I encounter most people, they seem to have a full appreciation for the fact that what, they just happened to be in the Bahamas at that time, and that the truth is we handled that very well, and that our legislative framework was in fact very strong in order to address that situation. Certainly, that's usually the sentiment among regulators. That's usually the sentiment among people who have a deep knowledge of the crypto world as well. But then there's the wider public that probably doesn't have that level of insight knowledge, and I think we're still fighting those perceptions, and we probably will always be fighting those perceptions in the same way that we'll always be fighting the perception that we're a tax haven, or that we're a money laundering center or something like that. Yeah.
One other question as well. Obviously, it's the FTX insolvency is fascinating in the sense that most creditors are going to be made whole, at least 100%. It already is. So at the time of recording, there's about $7 billion recovered. Yes, SBF is in jail for 25 years, but then the assets recovered. But the problem is it's at the dollarized amount, where Bitcoin at the time was worth around $17,000. I know there's not a regulatory matter, but maybe on a human level, what do you think of that? Because I myself was a creditor of FTX. Myself, many businesses are involved in. It's great recovery on a dollar basis, but
It is great recovery on the dollar basis. Unfortunately,
not on a crypto basis.
regulators, we're not allowed to speculate, and so when we
Yeah,
see that unraveling taking place,
yeah,
we're not allowed, to speculate at all. And in fact, asset managers know that that's rule
yeah,
101,
yeah.
and
So to switch
so
back to cash, everything.
yes, of course.
It is what it is. If it is, there was obviously many books and documentaries on this. There was one with Michael Lewis that actually mentions you. Have you read that book? And like, what's
So
your views
so
on
so
it?
let me tell you, Henry, I'm a huge fan of Michael Lewis, and I've read every book that he's written except that one.
Only,
Yes. And I to me, it'll be like listening to my own voice. I don't know that I can do it.
yeah, you know the story. So like, what's the point of there? And if you had a message, now that we're get 3 years, behind, like after the event, if you had a message to SBF, what would be that message?
So, I think one of the things that I said to him, when I met with him, and some of the liquidators, is that he needed people around him who would, one, set up guardrails, and two, enforce those guardrails even against him. And so, in the crypto world, and I guess it's the same for most businesses where you have a you have a strong founder. You have to make sure that your governance is also incredibly strong. And you have to appreciate that your governance is also there to protect you, and that's a primary function of it. In fact, yeah.
Yeah, it is definitely something that was lacking, as we found out afterwards on it. Were you
I
surprised? I
think
mean,
I think the way I described it is he needed adults in the room.
yeah, yeah, there was definitely, I think, a lack of that. Now that we look back at it, were you surprised? I mean, see, I guess on two things. One is, I mean, on a personal level as well, like the fact that he got 25 years, but also that his people around him got very, very light, relatively light sentences. I don't mean about Ryan Salame, which is something else, but let's say Carolyn Ellison, a lot of people from the Alameda group that were at the core of this. Were you surprised that they got off so easy, or with
So
lighter
so
sentences?
so so I think I probably was probably like the rest of the world. We were watching it and thinking what's happening here. But I'll be very fair. I do not understand the justice system in the U.S. and I don't understand the way the plea deals work, and so there's a lot of it I don't understand. But yeah, it was a little bit surprising to me.
I think a lot of people in the crypto community as well were. And as we coming to the end of the show, if you had a message to our listeners, obviously we have a lot of the people in the crypto listening to the show, a lot of people in the crypto compliance space. What's your one message to the broader public about not only the Bahamas, but also the work you've been doing at the regulator as well, but also about the crypto regulations in the Bahamas? And what's the one message you would have out there to them?
So since FTX, we've also developed a new piece of legislation, that actually we started developing prior to FTX, coming out of the crypto winter in late 2021, early 2022. We started developing a new piece of legislation, and we finished that work in 2024, and it's now been passed. What I would say is that right now the regulation of crypto, because capital markets regulators resisted it for a very long time, but now it's going in a very, very positive direction. I think that what you're going to see is you're going to see convergence around principles. So you're going to see that the big jurisdictions, whether that's Europe, the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, some of these big jurisdictions, on the basis of principles, you will see regulations converging. And I think you're going to see a lot more cooperation between jurisdictions in this space as well. I think it's going to be interesting to see where the U.S. is headed with their Clarity Act. I think those details will show us how serious they are about really regulating crypto. But I think that what I see right now is a shift. So about 4 years ago, it was very much focused around the crypto bros. Now you have a lot more institutional players in the space, institutional players that are used to the regulation of traditional finance, and so they expect regulation here. And so now you see regulation becoming more thoughtful. It's converging around principles, and so I think that's the future. I think crypto, certainly blockchain type activity, is here to stay, and it looks like tokenization will be the future. Which, in fairness to us, we predicted tokenization would be the future back in 2018. And so I think tokenization will be the future of crypto. And that's not just the tokenization of real world assets, but also the tokenization of finance products, securities, the tokenization of cash you're already beginning to see. And so I think you will see everything will be tokenized and fractionalized.
One last question. With obviously you mentioned the Market Clarity Act, the Genius Act in the U.S. What role do you see the Bahamas playing in the digital asset space now that the big elephant now in the U.S. is now pro crypto? What's the role you see the Bahamas play in the digital asset space?
So what I see is that if someone wants to be regulated, or someone wants to do business with U.S. persons, they will need to be regulated in the U.S. and they would need to seek that. If they want to do business with Europeans, they will need to be regulated in one of the EU countries that have signed on to the legislation. But they're probably outside of the major jurisdictions. They're going to be the rest of the world, LATAM, parts of Asia, where there are huge markets, and there'll probably be a gap in legislation, certainly a gap in aligning structures around what's going on in the big jurisdictions. I think that's where the Bahamas comes in. We can be a sort of rest of the world regulatory strategy for persons who may have, say, for example, a license in the U.S. to do business with U.S. persons, but they also want to operate elsewhere, and with no disrespect to the U.S. If they're going to operate outside of the U.S., most people outside of the U.S. wouldn't want their regulatory framework to be based in the U.S. And so the Bahamas could be a rest of the world strategy, but aligned with regulation in those major jurisdictions.
Super interesting. Ms. Rolle, really thank you very much for giving us this interview. I think many people, now that you look back, I think will really appreciate that you shared the insights, also your personal views on everything that happened. Again, I think I was very privileged, as you mentioned, to see the growth of the Bahamas from the early days when this was just an idea with all the dairy legislation, FTX, everything happened. And I have to say, I've had the privilege to work with many regulators over my career, and I really want to commend you and your team for all the work you guys have done in this space. And I think that's one of the reasons I want to have this podcast, so actually to share some of the great work that you and your entire team at the SCB have done. Right? Like I think you contributed greatly to the growth of the crypto industry over the years. So really, a big thank you on behalf of the broader crypto community.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening on this special episode of the Future of Crypto Compliance.
Thank you for having me, Henry. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. And thank you very much, everybody. If you like the show, please make sure to add a subscribe or like. It helps many others discover the show and allows us to invite great guests like we had today with Ms. Rolle from the Commission. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you all soon.